Good morning, Doomberg. Thank you very much for doing this yet again for part three. I appreciate your time.
Hey, I really enjoyed the first two conversations. Looking forward to the best one yet.
Your episodes are fan favorites, so you're back by popular demand.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love talking before you hit record. A lot of inbound invites from Canadian podcast hosts these days.
And as a refresher to the listener, you are one of, if not the top paid finance Substacks in the world, with subs including Jeff Bezos, I think.
Well, we don't know if he's a sub. He followed us on Twitter back in the day, but yeah, we're pretty large Substack in the finance category. Um, Coming in around 350,000 total subscribers here pretty soon. Growth is doing quite well. Obviously, a fraction of those pay us, but we're very happy to have that fraction. And near the top of the leaderboard, Michael Burry famously showed up, and pretty amazing. We spent 5 years toiling away at this business and podcast appearances and hundreds of articles. And Burry shows up, and in a month he's near the top of the leaderboard. And that's good for him. Actually, it's pretty fascinating insight into the future of Substack, which is probably a subject for another appearance. But yeah, it's been great. I have a hell of a ride coming up on our 5th anniversary here in a couple of months.
Pretty inspirational on the independent media, I guess, career path too. And the idea is that you can make a great living producing your own content nowadays.
Yeah, for sure. The distributed nature of information is altering the relationship between producer and consumer of information. And I think the legacy media has largely failed and has left open a wide window of opportunity for content creators who are dedicated to building trust with audience.
Mhm.
I mean, there's lots of ways to make money on content with clickbait and so on. We've joked in other podcast appearances that we could create two wildly successful Substacks, red meat for conservatives and red meat for liberals. And we'd know how to do it. We know how to sell it. It would print cash. And that's there, that exists. I think the algorithm changes on Twitter have only amplified that. But at the same time, I think Substack is more geared towards long-lasting subscription-based relationships with your readers. And our readers are our police. They keep us in line. And the nice thing about it is it's fully merit-based. The better you are, the bigger your audience. And, if our predictions don't pan out, maybe less people read us. If our writing isn't as good, if our editing slips, the market will tell you. And when other content creators come to see us, asking us for advice on how to replicate our success or the success we've observed others have, our answer is pretty simple. There is no trick. The trick is to be better. Like, just get up, show up, make the number go up, and improve every single day. And that's what we've been doing for coming up on 5 years. It's been pretty amazing.
Yeah. And so, speaking of quality insights and your thoughts, maybe to get into things, the supply and demand for oil. Last 10 years or so, we've been told that the demand for hydrocarbons will be going down. There'll be no use for them. However, the last few months, we've seen I guess, invasion or whatever you want to call it of Venezuela, partly for China to keep them out, but also for oil. So what do you think that says about the long-term demand for hydrocarbons?
The long-term demand for hydrocarbons is infinite, and the long-term supply potential of the Earth for hydrocarbons is infinite. Obviously, not technically so, because the Earth is a closed system. But for practical purposes, for modeling purposes, as lateral thinkers, we spend a lot of time thinking about zero and infinity. And the far superior operating mental model is that there's an infinite supply of hydrocarbons, and the only gating function for demand is availability and price. And why do we say that? Energy is life. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to waste. And we use that word waste carefully and scientifically, not flippantly. You cannot impose order on your local environment without wasting heat. The amount of order you can impose on your local environment is a direct measure of your standard of living. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. Therefore, the demand for primary energy, of which hydrocarbons still to this day produce 80 to 85% of global primary energy, the demand for that is infinite. And pardon the just 1 second here. We got a little dog action, but that's going to be taken care of. All right. So the 7 billion people in the global south have a standard of living that the average listener to your podcast would be unfamiliar with or certainly wouldn't tolerate for very long. And they consume energy at a fraction of what the Western countries do, certainly on a per capita basis. And for China and India to catch up to what the US consumes, for example, or Canada consumes, was 3, 4, 5 times current consumption times 7 billion people. And so this whole lie that hydrocarbon assets are stranded, or the world is somehow moving away from hydrocarbons, has been a really dangerous one, a really damaging one, and one that the global south has now begun to largely ignore. And we're running a piece on this just now, of course, about the whole China and its coal burning being, and how it's trying to use its solar capacity as a cloak to hide how much coal it's actually burning. And how the media just plays along and greenwashes China's coal burning. It's a pretty amazing story. But, the demand for hydrocarbons is infinite, and humanity's ability to supply it is infinite. And those are two excellent working mental models that we see no reason to deviate from.
And the proven reality is that energy is basically a causal relationship to development and technology, which makes human lives better.
And then in turn is used to locate and extract and use energy all the more efficiently. This is the grand misunderstanding that all metrics, all historical metrics of the energy sector's performance are backwards looking and do not account for the deflationary impact of technology. And so a rig count doesn't mean what it did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. People look at reserves as though they're a static figure and not an accounting figure, a political figure. The gating function of hydrocarbon production today is cultural and political, not geological, and it will forever be. And so this is where we are. The arrival of Trump, with all of his pluses and minuses, does bring with it a reset and a recalibration on the climate hysteria question and on the hydrocarbon question, which I think is probably a welcome one on balance. And the world is realizing that the days of voluntarily disengaging from the energy arms race are probably over.
Yeah. To set the scene, maybe peak ESG maybe could have been, say, 2020, where even in Canada there were senior federal cabinet ministers suggesting oil demand would peak by 2025, 2026. Fast forward to today, the president of the United States basically went into Venezuela partly for oil, which is a huge night and day difference.
Yeah, I mean, the Venezuela operation is a complex one. You could get into the psychology of it. We had been flagging it for some time. One of our better calls. We wrote a piece in December of 2023 called "The New World's Oil," basically pointing out that the Western Hemisphere could vastly outproduce the Middle East if it got its act together, and that perhaps getting its act together in the Western Hemisphere should be a higher priority in the U.S. Diplomatic corps. And then on Trump's inauguration day, almost a year to the day when we're recording this, we wrote "Misreading the Room," the social preview of which was, "If Greenland is the appetizer, perhaps Maduro's Venezuela will be the main course." And that turned out to be pretty prescient. Venezuela is in possession of an extraordinarily large hydrocarbon accumulation. It is often referred to as the largest hydrocarbon accumulation in the world, although there is some debate about what that means. In our view, it is roughly the equivalent of Canada. Sure, the geology is different and the techniques needed to extract it are different, but broadly speaking, it's around the same size and the same product output, at least as measured by API, as the oil sands of Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan. Obviously, most of the oil sands are in Alberta, but that whole Western Canadian deposit of hydrocarbons is roughly on par with what Venezuela has. And at its apex, Venezuela used to produce 4 million barrels a day. It produces less than 1 now. And if it's the functional equivalent of Canada produces 6 million barrels a day of oil and 20 BCF per day of natural gas. Venezuela produces 3 BCF per day of natural gas. So to a rough approximation, Venezuela is producing about 1/6 of what it should be. And the only difference between Canada and Venezuela is politics and contract law and culture. And that proves again that geology is nowhere near rate limiting, or that cheap oil has anything to do with geology or is even a thing. And in the New World's oil, we quantified, starting at the bottom tip of the southern part of the Western Hemisphere and going all the way to Mexico, there's at least 10 million barrels a day of incremental oil production to be had. And given the U.S.'s proximity and its historical claim of the Western Hemisphere as being in its sphere of influence, that just seemed like physics would dictate the inevitability of what we're seeing today.
Yeah. It's, I guess, realization on the realities of the importance of energy supply, maybe is one way to put it.
Yeah, and also part of a chess game against China, probably more so than just possession of the oil resources themselves. China had been encroaching, well, again, depends on your perspective, from the U.S. neocon global war games perspective. China had been encroaching in the Western Hemisphere using the same tactics that the U.S. did, debt-based, quote-unquote, investment into these developing countries, which then hooks them on you and your dependencies. And so the China sort of Belt and Road Initiative gone global, huge investments in power infrastructure, hydroelectricity, oil and gas development, support of the local currencies and all that stuff that happens when you try to exchange power for commodity resources, which China has been doing up and down the southern part of the Western Hemisphere for many decades now. And in a way, our view of the pivot to the Western Hemisphere is really it's kind of testimony to the growing weakness of the U.S., at least on a relative basis compared to China and Russia, that it needed to focus closer to home, sort of pick on somebody your own size kind of thing, having staring down the barrel of defeat in Ukraine, and with little that it could possibly do if China truly did make a move on Taiwan. The U.S. has decided to flex in its own neighborhood, which again just kind of makes sense. Cynical as all that might sound.
This episode is brought to you by Bedell Gas Compression. Proud to be recognized as an industry leader, Bedell Gas Compression specializes in reliable, custom-engineered natural gas compression solutions that support efficient operations. Backed by experienced field service and an unwavering commitment to safety and performance, Bedell is a trusted partner in the field. From flexible rental options to fully customized new builds, the Bedell team focuses on operational efficiency, safety, and long-term performance, helping producers keep gas moving where it matters most. Learn more at bedell.com. What was the peak oil myth, and why did you make that call?
Well, the peak cheap oil hypothesis, I guess, or conjecture, is that there's a finite amount of hydrocarbons under the ground, which feels intuitively correct. It is literally correct. We don't think it's operable. And the pace with which oil is being extracted is unsustainable. And therefore, humanity is on the cusp of running out of it, and societal and economic collapse will naturally follow, and you should buy whatever newsletter or investment product that I'm peddling while I'm making this case, which is based on fear. And by the way, any marketer will tell you that fear-based marketing is incredibly effective, which is why all governments try to use fear as a key element of their propaganda. So our view is quite the opposite, that the resource base that exists underground is so large, and humanity is getting so much better so quickly at identifying and extracting it, that the cure to any temporary shortage is itself the price. And so, sure, like oil could spike to 150 again, And if it does, get ready to buy some puts because within 6 months it'll collapse 90%. This is the nature of commodities spikes. And so let me give you a perfect example. We already talked about the difference between Venezuela and Alberta. Okay. Let's talk about the difference between Texas and California. California is like the birthplace of U.S. oil production, right? And huge embodied natural resource, including a giant shale that is purposely underexplored because they want to hide it. The only difference between Texas and California, Texas is a global energy gigapower and California is a flaccid energy vassal. The only difference between the two is politics, period. And okay, $300 oil and long gas lines in California and refinery shutdowns is going to wipe away that political class. And guess what replaces it? An energy-friendly political class. And if you unleashed Chevron and Exxon and the midstreamers and the natural gas companies in California with a similar regulatory regime that the Texas Railroad Commission has, for example, you would see an enormous growth in the output of oil. Let's just look at the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. Vaca Muerta is every bit as good as the Permian Basin. There's about 5 million barrels a day could happen there. Guyana, 0 to 100 million barrels overnight. Venezuela, I already said, they used to produce 4. They only produce 1, and it has nothing to do with geology. Tack back those 3 or 4 million barrels a day of oil. Brazil, huge oil and gas producer. Colombia has great potential. There's even oil on the northern part of Cuba, offshore. And we're not even talking about the changing definition of oil, which is undergoing a molecular semantic shift. And so this concept that the earth, humanity will soon run out of it, and because of that, prices will skyrocket, and that'll force a shift away, and then all of these assets will be stranded. It's just so nonsensical that it's amazing that the concept has enjoyed wide proliferation and has such stickiness.
And so on the subject of Venezuela, you had a great article out recently, Spoils of War, the oil and gas potential of Venezuela. So you're pretty familiar with the subject, but do you think, broadly speaking, it was a good idea to suggest going into Venezuela to get more oil, or do you think it's a bad idea? This episode is brought to you by Ambient. Ambient helps energy leaders improve production performance and expand margins through AI-powered optimization. Built on trust, transparency, and collaboration, the Ambient platform turns data into confident decisions, delivering measurable operational impact. Find out how Ambient expands the capacity of your production teams at ambient.com.
Again, Trump is an interesting character. And we like to say that Trump is everything all of his fans and critics say he is. Yeah, he's, the guy who hires Chris Wright as Secretary of Energy. He's the guy who wants to catalyze the nuclear renaissance, which we wholeheartedly support. He's the guy who wants to invest in and encourage U.S. and we think North American energy dominance, again, which we would wholeheartedly support. And he's the guy who launches Trump Coin 3 days before his inauguration. And he's the guy who, did Trump University and Trump Stakes and just flipped the bird to a union worker at a Ford plant who made a unsavory comment to Trump about a certain, who. And so he's all of those things. What happened in Venezuela is wholly incompatible with international law, international norms, and won't be without consequence in the long term. And then Trump's follow-on comment that he is not bound by international law and that he is only bound by his own internal moral compass. Again, an incredibly reckless statement, one which will be used as what is Russia looking at this and thinking about how it's behaving in Ukraine? What is China looking at this and thinking about how it intends to behave in Taiwan? So that statement works if you are truly the global, undisputed, omnipowerful country on earth, and the U.S. is just not that today. And so if it is truly the law of the jungle, you better be the apex predator by a wide margin. And the U.S. is just simply not. that. Any objective analysis, looking at the growth of China, the weapons production in Russia, the missile technology of North Korea, Iran, and Russia and China combined, and you can bet that they're sharing secrets and helping each other co-develop them.
Mhm.
The Orezhnik missile is barely mentioned in the Western media. It is a very dangerous weapon for which there is no known defense, certainly not amongst the NATO countries. Russia is outproducing all of the NATO countries combined by a factor of 4. This is from the head of NATO himself, Mark Rutte. This is not something that we're making up. China is by far the largest economy in the world. Don't believe the standard GDP statistics. You have to look at purchasing power parity. It is the manufacturing hub of the world. It makes enormous amounts of steel and weapons and bombs, and it does so on the back of burning coal. And so when the sitting president of the United States says that international law is irrelevant and international norms no longer matter, and that might is right, that means that we're very quickly going to reduce down to a nuclear confrontation, because the U.S. is not only the mightiest, not only is it not the mightiest country in the world anymore, it has certain huge advantages, and we don't mean to diminish the power of the U.S.
Yeah.
But it is not the mightiest by a wide margin like it used to be post-World War II, and other countries have larger and more sophisticated nuclear weapons arsenals than the U.S. does. So we note with interest overnight, maybe you saw, maybe you didn't, Tucker Carlson was out with an interview with somebody in the Russian political sphere who's I'd never heard of before, but who said that Putin has been warning privately through diplomatic channels that it is prepared to nuke Germany and the UK if the situation in Ukraine continues to escalate. Whatever you think of Tucker Carlson, whatever you think of Vladimir Putin, that is a very serious statement that we think needs to be heeded. Is the current administration capable of hearing such things and reacting responsibly? Hard to say. Let's hope.
Mhm. But from a oil perspective and energy perspective, I guess the fear is that the production is going to ramp up in Venezuela, and that's not a good thing for, say, Canada and whatnot. But it seems like the country has a lot of investment to make before major oil comes on. Do you view it that way too?
Yeah, I've seen that. We call it a psych op that's going on in Canada today. The
Yeah.
Orange Man Bad Venezuela play is going to be used to get the new pipeline over the line. And that's basically what's going to happen. And Carney being in China as we record this, it's all very consistent with that outcome being preordained, which is something we've been writing about for the better part of 18 months now. Alberta's energy needs to get unstuck. Canadian elite have understood this. Carney was brought in to do it, and he is doing it. And the last push over the line to silence the, renewables crowd, the climate crowd in Canada, which the Carneys of the world helped to stoke. Let's be honest. He's Nixon going to China. It takes somebody with Carney's background and pedigree to stare down members of his own coalition to say this is what we need to do for national unity, to insulate ourselves against Orange Man Bad, and also to protect against the deluge of Venezuelan heavy crude hitting the markets in the next 12 to 18 months. And so it is going to take a long time for Venezuela to significantly ramp up its production. But this crisis will not go to waste, and a new pipeline will be built and will be fast-tracked. That's our view.
Well, I hope you're right, because there are people in Canada, veterans of the industry, that might say, I don't really believe Carney and his intentions. Maybe he's getting forced into it, but I don't think, until I see a pipeline in the ground, I'm not sure this is actually believable. But I think it seems like you think there is reality behind it.
Well, I mean, we like to say the strongest proof that something was predictable is to have predicted it. And we wrote a piece in December of 2024 called Alberta Clipper, which foreshadowed the replacement of Trudeau with Carney and warned our many conservative-leaning Canadian subscribers that Carney, with the full weight of the notoriously pliant Canadian media propaganda machine at his back, would be a far more formidable candidate in the general election than Trudeau. And this was before even Carney was a contract that you could bet on Polymarket. And I believe the Conservatives were trading at 93 cents on the dollar that they would win that election.
Right.
And here we are. And so, and our whole mental model around making that call centered around the need to unstick Alberta's energy and how Carney would be inserted to do that. We followed that up in April of last year with a piece called "The Fix Is In," which built on that prediction, I think, quite presciently. And then the memorandum of understanding was recently signed, and all along the way, and God bless them, I love our conservative Canadian subscribers. Don't get me wrong. Subscribers are the foundation of our business. It's how I feed my family. So I don't want to, but we had endless Canadian subscribers commenting on our pieces or sending us emails or otherwise corresponding with us via DM about how this is all some elaborate scheme and Carney's not to be trusted and yada, 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 yada. I don't know. We're pretty far down the prediction path of what we outlined in Alberta Clipper for us to suddenly think that the entire foundation of that pretty good prediction was a fluke or it isn't actually going to get over the finish line. I think it would behoove our friends in Canada to believe your lying eyes for a little bit.
This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information.
And so what was that prediction, maybe for someone who hasn't read the article?
Over the series of articles, the prediction was basically that, look, I don't want to speak too conspiratorially. Let's say the power brokers that have strong influence in the trajectory of Canadian politics came to a conclusion that Alberta's energy needed to be unstuck, and a deal was cut with Trump to get Carney elected. Trump and Carney go way back, of course. Carney famously being the chair of the board of Brookfield Asset Management, which has $1 trillion in assets under management and very, very big in the real estate scene. I don't know if Trump knows anything about real estate, but I think he does. And all kinds of business interactions between Brookfield and the Trump empire in the past. And when Trump started ridiculing Justin Trudeau, 51st state, Governor Trudeau, our knowledge of Canada, which for an American-based periodical is probably pretty strong. We realized that one of the great sensitivities in Canadian politics is the constitutional stability of the Confederation, the separatist movement in Quebec, and the separatist fears in Alberta, and that what was needed to overcome the climate hysteria that had been stoked up by the very same power brokers was a fake constitutional crisis mixed in with a good orange man bad freakout, and somebody with Carney's pedigree and track record of being so green and so pro-climate hysteria that it was only somebody like him that could get it over the line. This is a great counterintuitive observation of politics. Like, again, when we say Nixon goes to China, Nixon was such a strong anti-communist that only he could have opened up China in the 1970s because he can deflect the attack from the right because he's got the bona fides. He's this long-standing, Eisenhower's vice president, anti-communist firebrand. If he's saying it's time to open up China, then maybe we should think about it. Well, it's a similar analogy with Carney. Nobody would have questioned Carney's climate credentials, right? And we got huge pushback when we made that call. No, look at what he said. Look at what he said. Look at what he said. Look at what he's done. Yes, it's precisely because he has said and done those things that he is uniquely qualified to stare down the beast that they've created. And he will. And that is a working mental model. And the thing about mental models and lateral thinking, which we've tried to explain in various articles and pro-tier Doom Zoom presentations is that they don't have to be right, they just have to work.
Right.
And as long as our mental model around unsticking Alberta's energy is working, we're going to stick with it. And look, the moment it stops working, we'll discard it. It's been an unbelievably great and effective model, one of our best. So, maybe we hang on to it too long, maybe we don't. It's still working. If the Conservatives have won, the riots in the streets over the MOU that was signed with Alberta would be ferocious. You didn't see any of that. You see a few protests. What's his name? Stephen Guilbeault or whatever, the environment. He resigned from the cabinet in protest, and you know what? The National on the CBC just moved on to the next story, right? I mean, there was not protests and riots in the cities like there would have been if the Conservatives had tried to do what Carney's doing, which is proof of our whole philosophy, which is only, the disciples of the movement can change the movement. No outsider can change them.
And so if the disciples of the movement are the ones instigating the change back towards the need and development of energy, where do you think that's coming from? The energy shortages perceived or real, or is it just why now? Why are they changing?
So who knows? Again, another attribute. So what is lateral thinking? Lateral thinking is when you have no emotional attachment to the correctness of your axiom. Mm-hmm. You just start with an axiom and treat it as true and brainstorm around it, compare it to the real world. If it's working, great. If it's not, ditch it. I don't know why Canada's elite changed. Don't really care. It doesn't really matter. They changed. It was very clear the change was coming. And again, we talked earlier about fear and propaganda, right? Back when we were talking about why does cheap oil sell? The great boogeyman in Canada is the country breaking apart. Mm-hmm. Canada's a very fluid country. Its borders are changing all the time on a time frame that matters. As measured in decades, borders are still fluid in Canada. Participation in the federal architecture of Canada is not assured.
Yeah,
and there are huge challenges to the stability of Canada based on its size and its cultural diversity.
Yeah,
and the disparity of economic outcomes that are seen in various regions. And the Western Canadian cultural heritage is just different than that of the Maritimes and of Quebec and of Ontario. Wholly different. I mean, most of them are Americans. You trace it back far enough. There's far more overlap between Alberta and Saskatchewan with Manitoba, with Montana and Idaho than there is with New Brunswick.
That's so true.
And Nova Scotia. And so when you need to get something difficult done, the first question that is asked of the puppet masters is, what fear can we stoke in order to convince people to do a 180 on something we had been using fear to convince them to do the opposite thing for decades? Mm-hmm. And so, in our view, constitutional crisis is what was needed. Nothing unifies Canada. A close second to a constitutional crisis in unifying Canada is a good U.S. freakout.
Or a hockey game.
Yeah, sure. More on the positive side, though, than I'm talking about, like, we need to change course collectively as a country. As much as the cultural dominance of the U.S. is a giant boogeyman in Canadian culture, the constitutional crisis of Quebec and the two votes, the two referendums, and the great violence that we saw in Quebec in the 70s and 80s, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau's famous "Just Watch Me" speech, which is the name of a piece that we once wrote a couple of years ago. All this, of course, is totally lost on our Canadian subscribers, which is kind of why we enjoy writing about it, because it feels so innovative and fresh to them. You would be surprised how many people didn't even know Saskatchewan existed when we wrote Tempting Target a couple of weeks ago. And so it's kind of fun. It's a nice little niche for us to occupy, because Canada is a really important country. It is a global energy superpower. Its citizens should be far richer on average, at least as measured by the median, than it currently is. It's a real scandal, and so there's so much potential. There's, still, despite all of the challenges in Canada that it has seen in the last 2 decades, amazing institutions, great contract law, the whole 9 yards, and so much potential, and so being able to bring from an energy lens at least that potential to our mostly American audience has been kind of fun.
Yeah. So I guess one question I also had is, when did you pick up on that? Because you've had a few articles through the years on Canada. When did you kind of stumble upon the curious issue of Canada?
I mean, Canada's been, for a variety of reasons, at the forefront of our analysis for a very long time. And for a variety of personal and professional reasons. And we try to be citizens of the world. And so, again, one of the things that I think differentiates Doomberg is our willingness to read everybody's propaganda. So, if you only listen to the CBC and read the Globe and Mail, you're getting a wildly different worldview than a synthesis of everybody's propaganda would give you.
Totally inaccurate.
And so if you want to do an interesting thought experiment, it takes some work. The next time there's a global world-beating headline, Trump snatches Maduro would be the most recent example of what we would call a world-beating story. It's above the fold, A1 in every major newspaper in the world that day, right? I mean, just is. It was such a profoundly shocking event. You read that event and how it's told in 8 different countries. Pick your 8 random countries. Get a good mix of them. So, for example, most major countries have English language official media outlets, right? Government owned, government approved, pick your favorite. So if you read how the Maduro event was described in the US, Canada, and Britain, Ukraine, Russia, China, Iran, Indonesia, and Brazil, you will get 8, 9, 10 wildly different stories of what actually happened. And if you do that just once, you will never be able to read your local propaganda the same again. And the truth is always some synthesis of the aggregate. And having read everybody's propaganda for so long, because our job as analysts is to be as right as we can be as often as possible and to make predictions. That's the job description. In order to get close to the truth, you have to be willing to read everybody's propaganda and then also develop open source information outlets, grade them over time. Having read everybody's propaganda, I can tell you that by far and away the worst is British propaganda, like not even close. And since Canada is kind of a derivative of Britain and its media is sort of a derivative of Britain, and the current prime minister used to be the head of the Bank of England, Canadian propaganda is not that far behind, unfortunately. And so British propaganda is so bad that in many ways it's a very effective contra. Like whatever's being described in Britain is a great test axiom for the opposite being true.
Right.
But again, doesn't mean it's not interesting or it's not useful. In fact, it's incredibly useful because of that. But if you just take the time, spend a couple hours and read how 8, 9, 10 different countries are describing a world-beating headline, and your eyes will be blown wide open at the vast chasm between what the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC are telling you and what Russia's TASS agency is telling its citizens and what the China Daily is telling its citizens. And so and then you'll often find that what these other countries are telling themselves is incredibly instructive for making predictions, because you can know in advance how they're going to respond to certain things. And what they're telling themselves is often wildly misreported or underreported over here, and vice versa. So it's pretty fascinating.
This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. GSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, GSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. Visit gsginc.com to learn more.
One of the main, I guess, ideas coming out of Venezuela and the recent headlines is that in terms of Canadian oil, it's not the threat that's been described, maybe.
Yeah, again, Canada needs to build that pipeline. And Alberta's energy needs to get unstuck. It is irresponsible to have one customer. Just is.
Yeah.
And so, ergo, the pipeline needs to be built. And it will be built.
Yeah, for sure, which is good for Canadian energy. Better to have more customers.
Yeah, and by the way, think in decades. These assets are immortal for modeling purposes. Once it's built, who cares what it cost? That's sunk.
Yeah.
Build the damn thing.
Yeah. Well, you had a couple questions from X. Do you want to go through a few of those, maybe?
As long as they're nice and polite.
Yes. One coming from a fellow called Mining Stocks. What is Doomberg's thoughts on silver? Is there, I guess, room on the price to go up, down? What are you thinking?
Silver's fascinating. So first of all, I don't own it. I own a ton of gold, personally, and members of the Doomberg team own a ton of gold. To my knowledge, no member of the Doomberg team has any interest in silver. I like to say that because I think you should disclose when you own something, because it colors your opinion. I've been watching silver. A good friend of mine, Sir JJ at Market Vibes, jj745.substack.com, great Substack. He's been trading. He's a 50-year trader in the pits, and he's been trading silver since it was in the 30s, and he's doing the best job of chronicling what's going on with silver. I'll just say this: I've been around. I've seen lots of spikes in commodities. Silver's a little different because it's a co-product, and so there's not really much elasticity of supply. But as my other good friend, Tony Greer, who writes a great trading letter, TG Macro, likes to say, if you won't sell into strength, when will you sell? Yeah. So, if you've been holding silver since it's been in the 30s and you saw it hit 94 overnight in Asia, ask yourself, when will you sell? These Icarus prints typically don't last. There's an awful lot of junk silver in the world. It's coming off the sidelines, heading to refineries. There will be a supply response. But hey, if you've made a ton of money in silver, God bless you. Just be sure to, as Tony likes to say, high five with one hand and make a sale with the other.
Yeah. Another question from Rinnock Insight. Given its ongoing expansion, where do you see China's SPR ceiling heading?
Yeah, so Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we wrote a piece that has chronicled the fact that China has been buying roughly an extra 1 million barrels a day of oil since the beginning of 2025. And one of the great trapdoors under the oil price could be that China just decides to stop doing that, or China no longer has the capacity to keep doing that. Now, one wonders whether there wasn't a deal cut with Trump and Putin on the whole Venezuela question, because China has been ramping up, in particular, its purchases of heavy crude prior to Trump's snatching of Maduro. But who knows? We're not in those rooms. There's a lot of oil in the world. I was thinking last night, here we have it, that Venezuela's leader has been literally snatched, kidnapped, extracted, whatever you want to say. Oil tankers are being fired at by Ukrainian drones, and Russia has effectively closed the port of Odessa, another underreported story here in the West. Tensions between Iran and Israel are back at the sort of June 2025 levels. And yet oil is below $60 a barrel. Right? What do you need? Barely above our equilibrium price of 55. If I'd have given you that fact set, you would have thought that oil would be back in the 70s or 80s. And the fact that it's not is testimony to just how much hydrocarbons are flowing out there. There's just so much of them. And I see all of the perma bulls on Twitter talking about where's the glut, where's the glut, where's the glut. The glut's in the WTI price. The market isn't wrong. Like the market is telling you that there's too much oil. There is too much oil.
Right. Yeah. That's, I guess, one thing that doesn't come up with the oil bulls on Twitter is the reality that there is a lot of oil.
And the definition of oil is changing again, which is they're like, NGLs don't count, is my favorite retort of people on Twitter. Like, don't tell me that you don't understand energy. But, I mean, like, NGLs count, my friend. I'm sorry. They just do. Natural gas is in abundant supply. There's so much natural gas in the U.S., Trevor.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. There's so much natural gas in Western Canada. You can't give it away.
Yep.
And by the way, it's the cleanest burning, cheapest hydrocarbon on the board. Of course, there's going to be engine switching.
Yeah. Is there a choke point that you think about that may turn the tide on pricing? Maybe.
I mean, temporarily, sure. There's always choke points. Again, our view is it's far better to fade spikes than to try to time them, which is our instinct with the whole silver question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I see that it has tripled. Historically, what happens to commodities that triple? They go down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, at some point, you have to make a sale. Otherwise, you just rode something all the way up and all the way down.
When, regardless of the, I guess, intentions of Trump in the Southern Hemisphere, one quote that I read, it came from Ryan Lance, CEO of ConocoPhillips, was that the idea was to lead through energy commerce instead of conflict, which I thought was actually pretty good and maybe a positive way to frame it. Do you think about it that way? And that it's better than conflict.
Well, I mean, that's one way to spin what was obviously conflict, I suppose. Trump's comments and behavior, I think, are damaging to the global system. Perhaps the global system needs to be damaged.
Yeah.
Certainly there's a case to be made. Trump has never been one for subtle tactics. The guy who rode down the escalator and said, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it is the guy that's currently president. And that's just the reality. And again, we have no emotional attachment to it. We just accept Trump is who he is. And we try to analyze the consequences. And, unless there's been some broader deal struck between China, Russia, and the U.S., pretty dangerous time. And again, I go back to, as a bit of a signpost, this whole Tucker Carlson little news boomlet this morning about, the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. I mean, why do you think they built those weapons? We like to say the reason why nuclear proliferation is such a hot topic is because once a country obtains them, you have to treat that country differently.
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about regime change in North Korea. So, I don't know. There's lots of ways to spin what happened in Venezuela. I suppose that's an interesting one.
And the, I guess, overarching tension is between the U.S. interests for cheap oil and supply, and that's the, I guess, Trump trying to keep oil in the 50s and whatever else is going on, but the support from the American industry, which would like to see higher oil prices. How do you think about that, where they kind of seem to be at odds with each other?
I'm going to cup my hands around my mouth and yell at the top of my voice, oil found in Venezuela. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, so here's another big misconception, that the price of oil today matters to anybody. Certainly not policymakers and the best of the well-managed oil and gas companies. They think in decades. And when you think in decades, possession is 90% of the value.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Trump would like $2.50 gasoline ahead of the midterms. What politician wouldn't?
Yeah.
But in reality, Venezuela is not about the midterms. Possession is 90% of the value. Oil found in Venezuela, it will get drilled. It'll take time. But, there's even Exxon, Garen Woods famously, and I think rather stupidly, saying that Venezuela was uninvestable to Trump in public with the cameras on. As true as that statement might be from his perspective, and as understandable as that statement might be from his perspective, it was unwise for him to say it in that moment. Of course, when has uninvestability crimped investment on the part of the E&P companies? Our answer is basically never.
Interesting. So what, at this point in time, January 2026 is maybe one of the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing in the oil markets?
Yeah, again, if you want to observe the long-term real price of oil, just plot it in ounces of gold and look at a 50-year chart. And do the same for any other commodity for which there's just an enormous supply of it. For as much as the US dollar has been debased, technological innovation in the oil and gas sector has outpaced debasement in geology because oil has never been cheaper in real terms. I could pull up while we're talking, the Bloomberg inflation adjusted price of oil, which uses $1983. As we're talking, the inflation adjusted price of oil is $19 a barrel.
Mm-hmm.
That's the price. And you bought oil in 1983, wasn't necessarily the best trade. So there you go.
Well, I think that's, covering of a few current topics, and I appreciate your time today.
It was great, Trevor. I really appreciate it. It was a fun talk.
I also curious if you're coming back to X anytime soon.
Probably not. We probably good chance for me to plug a couple of our products, if you don't mind. We're exclusively on Substack. We're investors in Substack, and Substack is our channel partner. And Substack has a Twitter variant called Notes, and it's a little smaller than Twitter. It's a little more friendlier than Twitter, a little less toxic than Twitter, although that's probably going to change as it grows. So, we're there as Doomberg, and we're also there as our sister publication, Classics Read Aloud, which is something we launched in September that we're really proud of. And so if people want to find more about us, they can head over to the Substack ecosystem or just go to Doomberg.com, and you can find everything there, including our link to our new Substack, Classics Read Aloud. And all of our work, all of our articles, our pro tiers, and our podcast appearances under our Doomcast page. So this one will be up there with a hyperlink. But yeah, so we're not on Twitter, unlikely to go back on Twitter for a variety of reasons we could probably talk about on a different appearance.
Awesome. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, great talking to you, Trevor. Have a great one.
Thank you.